I have filed this account in full, and I recommend it be sealed at the Assessor General's discretion. What follows is not a confession extracted from the subject. It is a confession extracted from us. My name is Jurath Enkel. I hold the rank of Senior Behavioral Assessor within the Vel-Khareth Tribunal facility at Adjudication Block 7. I have administered the psychological dissolution protocol on 43 subjects across 11 species over the course of my career. The protocol has never failed to produce behavioral fragmentation within the first 40 hours of continuous application. Our science is not uncertain on this point. We developed the protocol over generations of careful study. Every cognizant species we have ever encountered possesses the same fundamental architecture, a sense of self that is assembled, moment to moment, from sleep, from rest, from the small reprieve of unconsciousness that allows the neural substrate to sort signal from noise. Remove that reprieve long enough, and the self begins to unspool. The subject forgets which story is the true one. They grow willing to accept any story that makes the pressure stop. We brought the human into Adjudication Block 7 on the morning of the 42nd day of his capture. His name, by his own account, was Warrant Officer Dal Keswick. He was a logistics coordinator attached to the Human Deep Space Resupply Network, a middling rank, a middling role. The Judgment Panel had no interest in him personally. He was a means to a supply chain map, nothing more. Standard asset acquisition. We expected to have what we needed before the second day's session concluded. He entered the chamber under his own power. A small thing to note, perhaps, but I note it. Subjects brought before the panel after initial softening procedures typically require physical support. Keswick walked in, sat down in the subject seat without being directed to it, and folded his hands on the table. He was tired. I could see it plainly, the deep shadows beneath his eyes, the slight drag in his movements, the way he blinked once, slowly, before the session record light came on. He looked the way any subject looks at the beginning of Phase 1, diminished, quiet, cooperative in the flat, exhausted way that precedes genuine cooperation. Judge Primary Oreth Saul introduced the panel and outlined the terms of the proceeding. The human nodded. He did not ask for anything. He did not invoke protections or make demands. He simply said, in that flat voice, that he would answer what he could answer. We believed him. The first session ran 14 hours. He answered every question the panel put to him: supply depot locations, routing frequencies, restock intervals, chain of authority contacts. The answers were detailed, internally consistent, and completely useless. Every facility he described had been decommissioned or relocated. Every frequency he gave was 6 months out of date. We had better information in our own records. He wasn't lying exactly. He was giving us everything he had. It simply wasn't current. Judge Secondary Mavtho classified the session as inconclusive and ordered Phase 2 protocols, continuous environment maintenance with sleep suppression. Standard. The subject would be kept in the chamber with stimulus cycling, rest interruptions at 90-minute intervals, full lighting, and mandatory verbal engagement every 2 hours. We had broken a Grethvar fleet captain in 31 hours under Phase 2. We had broken a Sulen diplomatic courier, a species whose psychological endurance is considered exceptional in xenopsychology literature, in 44 hours. I will record what happened, as accurately as I am able. At hour 18, Keswick's cortisol analogs were elevated. At hour 24, his response latency had increased by a factor of 2. At hour 30, he was visibly unsteady when he stood to use the facility's amenities, and he asked, once, if he could sleep for 4 hours. Judge Primary Oreth Saul denied the request. Keswick said, "All right," and sat back down. The answers continued. That is what I cannot fully explain to anyone who has not sat in the assessor's chair and watched the monitors side by side with the session feed. The physiological record said one thing. The verbal record said something else entirely. Every measurable indicator of cognitive load was trending in the expected direction, toward dissolution, toward fragmentation, toward the point where the self loses its grip on its own narrative. His short-term retention was degrading. He began to repeat himself, occasionally, not because he was constructing a lie, but because he had forgotten he had already said it. His eyes would lose focus for 3 or 4 seconds before he caught himself and blinked back. But the core testimony did not change. We replayed Session 12 against Session 30. The panel expected to find drift, the small inconsistencies that appear when a subject's confabulation begins, when they can no longer remember which version of the story they told and begin assembling a new one from available fragments. The inconsistencies were not there, not in the operational details, not in the sequence of events, not in the things that mattered. Judge Tertiary Celeron ordered a full session rewind and comparative analysis at hour 40. She believed we had made an error. She believed the monitoring equipment had malfunctioned, or that the translation matrix had introduced artifacts that were being read as consistency when they were in fact repetition loops. The subject's cognition failing so completely that he was producing identical outputs not from memory, but from mechanical collapse. It was a reasonable hypothesis. I ran the analysis myself. The outputs were not identical. They were consistent. The difference is significant. Mechanical repetition produces the same words in the same order. What Keswick was producing across 40 hours of sleep suppression was semantically equivalent testimony that varied naturally in phrasing. In the sequence details were offered. In the small qualifications he added, "I think it was the third corridor," instead of "the third corridor." Small corrections to his own prior statements, where memory sharpened briefly and then faded again. This is not what a collapsing cognition produces. A collapsing cognition produces either rigid loops or increasingly incoherent noise. He was producing neither. At hour 52, Keswick put his forearms on the table and rested his head on them, briefly, before one of the monitoring staff activated the stimulus protocol, and he lifted his head again. He did not complain. He looked at the panel camera and said, "I've told you everything I know. I'm sorry it isn't more useful." I sat with that sentence for a long time after the session concluded. By hour 60, the judgment panel had stopped asking about the supply network. They were asking him to describe, again, the sequence of events leading to his capture, not because the information was valuable, because they were running the sessions back against each other and still finding nothing. He answered. He had answered the same question 17 times across the session record, and the 17th answer matched the first in every material detail, while differing from it in the way that any person's retelling of a real event differs across multiple conversations, not in the facts, but in the small organic variability of genuine memory. I am a behavioral assessor. I have spent my career studying the relationship between physiological stress and identity coherence in cognizant species. What I observed in the Keswick sessions was something our models do not account for. We had always assumed that identity coherence and cognitive function were coupled, that when one degraded, the other followed, because the self is assembled from cognition, and without the substrate, there is no self to cohere. Keswick's sessions suggested that in humans, these two systems are not coupled in the way we assumed. His cognition was degrading, his processing speed was declining, his recall for new information was compromised, but the identity that had formed over the prior years, the man, his account, his knowledge of himself and what he knew, was not stored in the same place as the systems we were suppressing. Or it was stored there, but anchored there, in a way we do not understand. We could not reach it with sleep deprivation because it was not assembled moment to moment. It had already been assembled. It was structural. What remained of Dal Keswick at hour 90 was not all of him, but what remained was coherent, and it could not lie, not because he was resisting. I do not believe he was resisting, not in any technical sense, but because the parts of a human mind that construct and sustain deliberate deception appear to be among the first casualties of deep sleep suppression. What we had done, in 90 hours of protocol, was strip away everything except the truth. We had not broken him. We had refined him. I filed my assessment on the morning of day 5. My recommendation was, release with standard non-disclosure protocols. The information Keswick possessed was already dated. The protocol had failed to produce actionable intelligence, had failed to produce behavioral fragmentation, and had produced instead a result that I believe warrants immediate revision of our xenopsychological models for this species. The judgment panel voted 4-1 to run the protocol a second time. I recorded my dissent. It is in the file. I also noted, for the record, that when the session lead informed Keswick of the panel's decision that the procedure would continue for another 90-hour cycle, he looked at the camera for a long moment, then looked down at his hands, and then he said, "Okay." Not in defiance, not in fear, not in anger. He said it the way a man says it when he already knows the answer to a question you haven't stopped asking yet, and he is simply waiting for you to stop.